Russian elections are rigged. Political opponents are imprisoned or otherwise eliminated from participating in the electoral process. The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, too. Anyway. 75.
It's Britney, bitch.
And the Iraq, everywhere like such as.
I'm supposed to be the franchise player, and we're in here talking about practice.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
Out, Charlie! Out!
Our next door neighbors are foreign countries.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Hey everybody, and welcome to Remember Shuffle. My name is Ben. With me as always is my co-host Jordano.
Ben, I gotta give you a warning against recording a series on the Iraq War. The problem is, it's a quagmire and you have no clear exit strategy. You don't see the end of the road. You're gonna be in there far longer than you think you will be.
Actually though, yes.
Where do you finish? With the insurgency? Civil war? ISIS? It happened to me, it could happen to you, Ben. I'm just saying.
Welcome to part 2 of our Iraq War series. Now, this episode is going to focus specifically on the period of time from 2001 to 2003. That's specifically limited on the selling of the war in these gradually expanding circles. So first, convincing the skeptics within the Bush administration, because there were some, then convincing the military, then convincing Congress, and then finally convincing the American people. And the main thesis for this episode is that this horrible war is the fault of like 12 guys in the Bush administration, give or take. And I know that the leftist view of politics and history prefers to look at systems rather than individuals, look at history through a material lens more than great men of history. But the Iraq War is pretty unique because there are 12 fucking guys who have an ideological vision of neoconservatism, and they are able to just bull rush over everyone else. And yeah, it's just kind of crazy that this small cadre of dudes with a unified goal can do so much fucking damage.
Yeah, and there'll be two stories happening in parallel here during this episode. The first being the selling of the war to all of these people that we just mentioned, but then also the preparation for the war. You have to actually prepare for war. You can't really wing it. You know, as von Moltke said, you do not improvise the deployment of millions. So we're going to be sort of tracking from September 11th to the invasion of Iraq. What is going on to both sell the invasion to people and to actually prepare for the invasion.
And as we will see, the Bush administration did less preparing for the Iraq War than we do for an average Remember Shuffle episode. Before we get going, bibliographical note, the main source that I read for this episode was Thomas E. Ricks's book Fiasco, the American Military and Adventure in Iraq, 2003 to 2005. And I would add that this guy is a turbo normie, right? This guy was the Washington Post's main Pentagon correspondent. So he's a guy who on paper believes in the role of the U.S. military. He knows the generals and the politics of the Pentagon. And even this guy has to call his book Fiasco. I kind of wanted to use this source as my primary source just to make the point that you don't even need to be a fucking Noam Chomsky leftist firebrand to hate on this war. Even someone who is almost certainly center-right can see the writing on the wall.
Yeah, I really wanted to get to the bottom of whose fault this whole thing was. So I read Fiasco, and then finding myself going, well, it's kind of pointing the finger at Bush. Let me read George Bush's autobiography, Decision Points, and see what he has to say about this whole mess. And George Bush, I would say, largely blames George Tenet in his book. So I'm like, oh, well, now I got to read George Tenet's book. So I pick up George Tenet's book, and George Tenet blames 9/11.
Lindsay and I have hit a bit of a rough patch.
Really? When did that start?
Well, I don't want to blame it all on 9/11, but it certainly didn't help.
So I picked up the 9/11 book.
Yeah, it's the same title as O.J. Simpson's autobiography, If I Did Do It, by the Twin Towers.
It's so funny because both Decision Points and George Tenet's books are written from the perspective of, hey, I know that I fucked up. They both open with this statement that like, hey, listen, I was wrong sometimes and I'm including those in the book. And then George Bush just never does that. Whereas I would say George Tenet, he like repeatedly insists that he never gave the president information that he wanted to hear, but then he just like does that throughout the book. It's a little bit more honest, I would say. A little bit easier to read. I also read Bob Woodward's Plan of Attack because it got referenced a lot on Blowback, and I thought it might be interesting.
Okay, signposting. Here's the plan for today. We're going to talk about some of our characters. We're going to paint you a portrait of the neoconservative. Then we'll go on to our history lesson of the period from 2000 to 2003. 2001 to 2003 mostly. We'll do our themes and big ideas. We'll do a little film review of Ianucci's In the Loop, which is about this exact period, and then we'll offer our concluding thoughts. So let's start off with our characters.
The first batch of characters that we'll talk about here are neoconservatives. We'll define their overall ideology in a moment, but these are people who got what they wanted. They are the primary people driving us towards the invasion of Iraq. Right? Mm-hmm. So suspects number 1 and 2, Paul Wolfowitz and Doug Feith. These guys are undersecretaries under Donald Rumsfeld, and they are nerds. They're bow-tied nerds. Doug Feith specifically, go look up what he looks like. He looks like a guy that would be on your debate team in university.
If you remember those Tootsie Pop commercials with the owl, he kind of looks like that owl from the Tootsie Pop commercials.
And so these are people that, like George Bush, when he wins the presidency, gets to hire into civilian leadership, and they're Project for a New American Century people. They have this idealistic worldview that we'll get into in a moment. So they both work for Donald Rumsfeld, who's the third character here. Longtime conservative politician, was Gerald Ford's Secretary of Defense, 30 years before this?
Yeah, in the 70s, he was the youngest guy to ever be Secretary of Defense, I believe, when he took it on.
More importantly, 2002's People's hottest cabinet member. He was in People magazine's hottest cabinet member.
Listen, you got to go to war with the cabinet you have, okay? That's not the cabinet that you might have or could have.
Who is he really competing with in that cabinet? You know, certainly, I guess, better looking than Doug Feith. And we got Dick Cheney. Have you heard about this guy? He's the devil, I guess. That's what Christian Bale said. He wants to keep the country safe. That's his big motivating force, ostensibly. His chief of staff, Scooter Libby, longtime intern for Remember Shuffle before he was replaced.
Oh, yeah, we made Scooter jokes. I forgot about that. It's Remember Shuffle Mark 1 joke.
A college student of Paul Wolfowitz, actually. He's a Columbia Law School lawyer, really good at needling people. Sort of doing the, would you say that this is true? And if that's true, then this is true. And like the lawyer attack dog for Dick Cheney.
He would also later go to jail in the 2000s, right? Scooter Libby.
Well, I mean, he outed a CIA agent in the field as revenge because the husband of that CIA agent went to the press and said, I investigated the yellow cake deal in Niger. There was nothing there. Yeah, he was pardoned by Bush, but he was still disbarred until Trump
reinstated his law license
in 2017. Yeah.
God damn. Also, before we move on quickly, I think the most interesting thing about Rumsfeld and Cheney in this mix is that both of those guys had their fingerprints on the first Iraq war in the first Bush presidency. Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense under the first Bush administration. And so he actually moves from being one of these more realist people who defended the limited war of 1991 and morphs into one of these even more ghoulish neoconservatives over the course of the 90s.
Yeah, next up we have George Bush. I mean, listen, you know who George Bush is, hopefully. Go listen to our episode on him if you don't. But he is complicit in all of this. But essentially, this group of guys, Bush, Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, along with 6 other Bush administration guys specifically, were amongst 25 founding signers of the Project for a New American Century. And we'll get to this more later, but I mean, essentially, this is a post-Cold War vision of America embracing its role as a global leader and beacon of freedom and democracy in the world. It calls for the United States to have a policy of military strength and moral clarity. So they're the people that are being handed over the keys to the White House.
We mentioned them at the end of the Part 1 episode. In the 90s, they are a lobbying group that literally instills into law regime change in Iraq as a goal of the American government. Long before 9/11.
Right. They actually got Clinton to do that in 98.
Yeah.
And so these are our people who are mostly like driving decisions towards invasion. There's a next group of people who allowed themselves to be used. I would say that the caricature of these people as being sort of obstructionists to the neocons' plans is overblown. I think, if anything, this sort of Armando Ianucci view of the world was probably more true, where they cared more about their personal career than actually obstructing George Bush. But we have this group of people: George Tenet, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, and Tommy Franks. And these are people who allowed themselves to be used by the Bush administration while not being sort of dyed-in-the-wool neoconservatives themselves, were happy to be of use to this movement in exchange for, career boosts.
Yes.
So we'll start off with George Tenet. He's the director of the CIA. He's hired by Clinton. He's our second longest director of the CIA. He was there for 7 years. Parents are Greek immigrants from Queens. He was the director of the CIA during 9/11. And so, as you might imagine, a lot of the decisions he makes after that are colored by that. I think he feels responsible and like he doesn't want to make a mistake like that again. And it allows him to be very malleable to George Bush. Hilariously, he becomes like the fall guy for the Bush administration. After all of this, they can point to George Tenet and be like, well, George Tenet said it was all true, so I had to take his word for it.
Continuing to be CIA director after 9/11 happens is fucking wild. Imagine you shit yourself at your office job and just kept going to that job. You're always going to be the guy who shit himself in the cubicle.
I think he brings that up in his autobiography quite a bit, where it's like, you're always the guy who let 9/11 happen.
In a best case scenario, you're the guy who let it happen. In a worst case scenario, you're the guy who did 9/11.
Colin Powell, next up, Secretary of State. He's the guy with credibility. So he was, of course, the guy who trotted out in front of the UN to make the case for war. A former soldier in Vietnam, which I think a lot of people point to when trying to explain his personal morality towards the situation, because he was on the ground fighting in an unjust war. And the story you hear all the time is that when you're in that situation, you sort of curse the people above you, the commanders and the generals and the civilian leadership, for putting you in this horrible position of needing to fight an unjust war. Ostensibly, he was marked by this experience and never wanted to do it to people again, despite the fact that he very much would do that to people again.
Yeah, and I mean, that's certainly the narrative. And as we saw in part 1 of this episode, he was one of the architects of the first Gulf War's limited engagement, overwhelming force, clear exit strategy, because he didn't want to get bogged down in another generation-long quagmire like he fought in. So there's certainly an element of truth to that. We'll get into Colin Powell later, but I think he got a little bit high off the supply of fame that he got. He was one of the first black chiefs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And so libs and moderates really loved him for that, for like id Paul reasons, even though I'm pretty ssure he helped cover up the My Lai massacre when he was in Vietnam. I think that is part of his career. I think that's a line on the resume for Colin Powell.
Condoleezza Rice is a national security advisor. Sometimes these titles, I'm like, what exactly is the purview of the national security advisor compared to the director of the CIA or the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense? Or
the Undersecretary of Defense. Yeah, there's too many fucking offices. Where was Doge when you needed it?
I think it's mostly just due to like the permutations of like function versus department, which is supposed to give you, checks and balances. Condoleezza Rice, she later becomes Secretary of State. I think the narrative around her usually is that she didn't do enough to stand up to Bush because she was starstruck by all these people. Tommy Franks, he's the main army general for Afghanistan, credited with a really big win in Afghanistan. But he's really more of a tactics guy, putting together war plans, not inclined to disagree with the president or chain of command. Sort of allows Donald Rumsfeld to reduce the number of troops needed, as we'll see. Then we got our third group here, the smallest group, people who were opposed to the war, including Anthony Zinni, General Zinni.
This guy was the architect of the containment strategy throughout the 90s. He was the military expert on Iraq who made a ton of plans because he was asked to, and his plans were completely ignored. And he was a pretty vocal opponent of the war because he was already retired by the time it started. So I think part of the problem was that we had no fucking Zinni?
I mean, we'll see throughout the story that most of the people who were opposed to the war were retired. And then the lone sort of politician you hear about a lot is Ike Skelton, who is a U.S. Congress representative from Missouri and a ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. So we'll hear from him throughout this story. All right, so These are our characters.
There are obviously more, like Bernie Sanders voted against the war, as we all know. Obama was opposed to the war, although I think he was just in the fucking Chicago State House or whatever. Like, this is not a comprehensive list of the people who were opposed to the war. We wanted to point out the people who were, like, in the military or close to this administration who were opposed to the war as it was construed. And it's a short fucking list, but they were there. So let's describe one of the most destructive ideologies of the 21st century before we get to our history lesson. Neoconservatism. We talked about this on our last episode, the difference between a realist and an idealist, and the neoconservatives are one of these subcategories of an idealistic foreign policy. And they have all of the utopian thinking of a 1960s hippie or radical. If a hippie thinks that all we need is acid and love, then a neoconservative thinks all that we need is free markets and liberal democratic elections.
Yeah, they have end of history brain. The Cold War is over. They've been vindicated in this victory, and they believe that what the world needs now is not love, but liberty, personal freedoms. And so in this post-Cold War world, they have this view that, hey, it is now our mission as America, as a global leader in liberty, to export this all over the globe, to get every country to remove despots, to make sure that everybody can go to the damn polls, no matter where they live.
And any interventions in the economy that you have to meet people's needs, like Saddam subsidizing staple foods, that is as tyrannical as when he gassed the Kurds. They are the same. They are the same thing.
I want to tell this funny story because you might be wondering how Tony Blair fits into this, but there's this great story, and George Bush tells it in his autobiography of right after he wins the election, Tony Blair comes to visit him at Camp David. And George Bush says, like, hey, what do you want to do? I was thinking of watching Meet the Parents. And Tony Blair says, oh, yeah, yes, absolutely. I'd love to watch Meet the Parents with you. And so George Bush sort of wraps a bow in this whole experience by being like, I didn't know what to make of Tony Blair, being that we had different politics, but then he told me that he wanted to watch Meet the Parents with me, and he believed in the transformative power of liberty. And it's like, this is the bond that they share, is this belief that everybody wants to be American. Everybody wants free markets and to be able to go to the damn polls and vote. The transformative power of liberty is the one thing that's really consistent in George Bush's messaging. If you watch him in like the 90s until today, even when he's speaking at the George Bush Foundation or whatever, is all about the transformative power of liberty.
The people of Iraq, they want to watch middlebrow comedies like Meet the Parents, and they can't.
They can't watch Meet the Parents there. Over there, it's about a story of bringing home a Shia guy or a Kurdish guy. I guess he'd still be Jewish.
Yeah.
I love that movie because my dad did the same thing to Laura on our first date. My dad hooked her up to the lie detector machine.
Yeah, and so the neoconservatives view the world through a completely black and white, good versus evil lens. And the means to bring about the world that they want is force. Overwhelming American force. We're going to use it, and not just to like tinker around the edges and maintain stability. We are going to recreate the fucking world. Again, like a 1960s utopian. Paul Wolfowitz is a really useful example for a figure of the neocon, because he sees everything through the lens of the Holocaust, in which he lost most of his extended Polish family. So as the US is doing containment on Saddam Hussein, and as it's working, Saddam is contained, he's writing things in the New York Times like, what if the West had tried to contain Hitler? And he also sees the World War II analogy in that the American people sometimes need a little push. The American people are at their core isolationists. But sometimes you got to move them along a little bit to do the right thing, the morally just and righteous thing, because people won't do it without that little push. And this is a guy who, an army officer in Iraq, Paul Arcangeli, described as dangerously idealistic and crack-smoking stupid. So the troops aren't a huge fan of him.
Yeah, and we'll see this throughout the entire story, that the military leadership specifically hates these guys, Doug Feith and Paul Wolfowitz, like civilian leadership guys who are fucking nerds, who don't really understand all of this other than the storybook way that their mind imagines it to be.
Yes.
And like I said, they're fucking nerds. They're bow tie debate team guys. I mentioned that George Bush blames George Tenet, but Tenet, as much as he blames 9/11, he also blames Doug Feith a lot. This is Feith's clapback, which I did find. I clap back at George Tenet for blaming him for the war. Feith says, "The date physical descriptions, the quotation marks are all, in the words of Gilbert and Sullivan's Mikado, merely corroborative detail, intended to give artistic verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative. So... So this is the guy, in his clapback for not causing the war in Iraq, makes a Gilbert and Sullivan reference.
God
This
damn.
is who we are dealing with. These are the guys who are going to go to the military and tell them how the war should be fought. And so it's no surprise that the military guys have nothing but the most hilarious insults for these guys.
Yeah, just pure contempt. These are all professorial guys. Some of them literally were professors. They're nerds. Another big thing about the neocons is this generational divide. It rhymes pretty nicely with the fact that we have the George W. Bush, Bush Jr. administration. The folks who actually lived through World War II were not neocons. Who lived through or served. Poppy Bush was not a neocon. Their goal is stability at all costs to prevent large wars. And yeah, maybe you do some CIA shit on the side with some coups, but the idea is don't get involved in big wars. Ditto for any military figure who spent time in Vietnam, like Zinni or Powell. Their foremost goal is to avoid entanglements like Vietnam. But the neocons didn't actually have to live through any of this shit. Maybe they were draft dodgers in the 60s, and they lack any and all military experience. So for them, stability isn't the goal. I'm lifting a phrase from Thomas Ricks here. Stability is the target. They don't want stability. You can't remake the world under stable conditions. And remaking the world is their goal, which is scary. And because the name is neoconservative, which is an inherent contradiction, to conserve means to keep the same, and neo means new, because they're still conservatives, they balk at the government doing things. They balk at the government spending money. And so they're trying to run everything like a business. They bring the McKenzie mindset to the world of war making. So Rumsfeld and the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense and the Pentagon, are haggling over troop numbers. The military says, we need this. Zinni, who had run containment for over a decade and had drafted up plans for an invasion of Iraq, said that it would take at least 350,000. Rumsfeld offered him 10K. It's like Jack Donaghy shit. And now we let the negotiations begin.
As a bargaining move. Instead of just trusting the expert, you're going to trust Doug Feith and his bow tie when he says that they could do it with 10.
I mean, a lot of those Gilbert and Sullivan plays are about the Navy,
Yeah, we're going to send the HMS Pinafore to invade Iraq. One of the ways that they exert power, these neocons, is by creating committees in the wrong places in order to get around experts. So Doug Feith and I think Rumsfeld make the Office of Special Plans to supply George W. Bush with raw intelligence without having to go through the CIA where it could be vetted by analysts and disproved.
People who know things, yeah.
Yeah, and we're going to see this is really important later because analysts have a job that they specialize in and, they go over information and they ascertain if it's fact. And the way that they gather intelligence, if you're like Doug Feith, is the way that like a podcast might gather intelligence or something, right? Like it's just to prove a story that you already have in mind. A true crime podcast, not this one.
Yes, correct.
And so it's like the difference of getting history from a podcaster versus an academic scholar. The other thing they do is the Office of Strategic Influence, which was a committee they set up to create false stories in other countries in order to promote U.S. interests. So basically the Department of Overseas lying. Because the Department of Defense is actually not allowed to do regime change, I learned. That was a surprise to me. This had to be closed as well because basically all of these things are not allowed for a reason. They were done to circumvent the regular channels that we have. But yeah, they have this very simplistic, childlike view of the world when it comes to liberty and freedom.
Yeah, I want to quote one of Rumsfeld's assistants, who he writes in an op-ed in the Washington Post. I believe demolishing Saddam Hussein's military power and liberating Iraq would be a cakewalk. Let me give simple, responsible reasons. 1, it was a cakewalk last time. 2, they've become much weaker. 3, we've become much stronger. And 4, now we're playing for keeps. It's how a child would talk, right? Like, if the realists were playing geopolitical chess, this guy's playing, I don't know, geopolitical jacks or something.
That reminds me so much of a story I found of George Tenet in one of the thousands of dumb meetings that seems to have taken place in the White House, where they meet to talk about Iraq. And what Doug Feith wants to talk about is like, once we invade the country and we take Saddam off the money, who should we put on the money instead? Maybe some figure from ancient Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar, And Tenet is incredulous because he's like, I mean, in Tenet's mind, he's always the clip of Homer Simpson where he's reimagining an argument he had with Marge where he's much smarter.
I remember that meeting and I have a photographic memory.
Legalized gambling is a bad idea. You can build a casino over my dead body. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah.
For you, it's the president.
Yellow. And then I said to the president, get this.
That's George Tenet in his entire autobiography. But he's thinking these things without saying them. George Tenet is thinking to himself, well, what about sectarian violence? What about the effect that it would have on Iran? You're just worrying about who's going to be on the money, but you're not thinking about all these more important things.
If only someone was in a position of authority to raise such issues. Director of the CIA, George Tenet.
So these are the ways in which they have this very childlike view of the world.
Yeah. In short, the neocons think that diplomacy is for pussies and that weakness only invites aggression. And I'd like to quote my man Zinni, the retired Marine general. He said, quote, I think, and this is just my opinion, that the neocons didn't really give a shit what happened in Iraq and in the aftermath. I don't think they thought it would be this bad. But they said, look, if it works out, let's say we get Chalabi in, he's our boy, great. We don't. And maybe there's some half-assed government there. Maybe some strongman emerges. It fractures. And there's basically a loose federation. There's really a Kurdish state. Who cares? There's some bloodshed and it's messy. Who cares? I mean, we've taken out Saddam. We've asserted our strength in the Middle East. We're changing the dynamic. We're now off the peace process as the centerpiece, and we're not putting any pressure on Israel. This is how the neocons think, right? If it's all through strength, if it's all through recreating the world, who cares? Let's just knock out Saddam and see what happens. Get weird with it.
Yeah, so we just thought it was important to set up the people that are driving all of this, because it's not an accident. It was through their will and ideology acted on. You read stories like this and you're like, damn, I really wish someone who had an ideology for, say, socialized healthcare.
Yeah, where are those 6 guys?
Union membership. Like, I just wish that somebody was doing everything in government that Doug Feith was doing for Middle East intervention.
And I think it's also important because if you ask someone like Michael Moore, the Iraq War happened for oil and contracts for Halliburton. And I'm not saying that's not part of it, but I don't think it tells the whole story. I don't think the greed angle solves it. I don't think the Israel lobby alone solves it. I think the truth is much grimmer, which is that these 12 guys just fucking wanted it because they get off on American strength and reinventing the world. And they had a vision, a horrifying, violent, awful, evil vision. And all the other stuff, the greed and the Israel lobby and everything else, that is secondary to my mind.
The only exception to this, I think, is Dick Cheney. Halliburton's going to go from being like a $5 billion company to like a $45 billion company over the course of Bush's term. They're going to be providing a lot of services that are going to be required of the military contractors in this war. And he's the former CEO of Halliburton, and who won a lot of no-bid contracts. I don't see him as like a dyed-in-the-wool neoconservative. I just see him as someone who saw the opportunity to profit.
Okay, so let's get to our history lesson. Czechia and our policy in the 90s contained Saddam. As we saw in episode 1, this is a smashing success. The U.S. military has this simmering conflict. They're flying 34,000 sorties every year over Iraq to enforce the no-fly zone. That's the equivalent of rerunning the Gulf War in its entirety every 3 years. So it's not nothing, but it's not an all-out war. At this point, the Saddam must go crowd, the neocons like Paul Wolfowitz, they're a dissident minority voice. They're generally disdained by the people who are in power, but they're starting to make some noises with their think tanks. Now, one of the reasons that the neocons hate the containment is that they say it's too expensive. We're spending all this money to contain Saddam. Wouldn't it be quicker just to get rid of him? Here are your numbers for you. The no-fly zones cost America $1.5 billion a year, which is just slightly more than what occupying Iraq would cost in a week in 2003 or 4, where the burn rate was between $60 to $70 billion a year. You got to spend money to make money.
Think about the long-term savings in perpetuity.
And yeah, America is still fucking shit up. In 1998, they launched the largest attack on Iraq since the end of the Gulf War, Operation Desert Fox. So Clinton launches 415 cruise missiles. That is about 100 more than were fired during the actual Gulf War, plus another 600 bombs to hit a total of 97 sites. I bring this up mostly because this attack happened shortly after the Lewinsky scandal breaks. So some people think it was a little distraction. And after this, Americans draw two different reactions to this operation depending on their ideology. If you're Zinni and his crew, you see Desert Fox and you say, containment is clearly working. We've contained Saddam day to day with fewer troops than go to work every day to the Pentagon in Northern Virginia. It didn't take all that many people to fly all those planes. But if you're Wolfowitz, you draw the opposite conclusion. You say, if the regime is so weak, it would be easy to remove it, perhaps by having the United States train Iraqi rebels. They thought about running, and I'm not even joking, I'm not being racist, this was the name of it, the Bay of Goats. God. Why would you name the operation after one of the most famous CIA failures of the Cold War? And at this point, alarm bells are ringing. America's Arab allies start to panic because they're starting to worry, if Saddam falls just from the pressure of containment, does America have a plan for this exodus of Iraqi refugees? And the answer is no, that they don't. They do not at all. Zinni starts making some plans and doing some war games, but he can't interest any other part of the government in preparing for the fall of Saddam. And this Zinni guy is truly a fucking Cassandra, because he said in a congressional hearing, I think a weakened, fragmented, chaotic Iraq, which could happen if this isn't done carefully, is more dangerous in the long run than a contained Saddam is now. Correct. True. And just as we wrap up the late 90s, just kind of retreading the end of our last episode, to give you an idea of the state of things pre-9/11, Foreign Affairs magazine puts out some articles by some of these national security organizations like the RAND Corporation that are just totally putting Wolfowitz on blast by name. These guys are not being taken seriously in the late 90s. He gets disparaged for supporting the rollback fantasy, and they quote him disapprovingly and his stupid Bay of Goats idea. We have the 2000 election, which we've covered on this pod. Nobody makes any move towards toppling Saddam. Bush famously says our troops shouldn't be nation builders. Cheney's out there defending the 1991 decision not to topple Saddam. And for the folks in the military, they're a little nervous about the proximity of some of these neocons, but they see Powell in the cabinet, and they think that this guy will keep them in line. The Bush administration, when it's quote-unquote elected in 2000, has this weird hodgepodge of neocons and realists. So then we get to 9/11. Giordano, have you heard it changed everything?
It really did. They really used it effectively to start the war in Iraq.
Yeah.
George Tenet tells a story about meeting with, I think, Rumsfeld, Bush, and Cheney, and they agree that Iraq isn't part of their immediate response to 9/11. However, you can already hear the bits being chomped at by Wolfowitz and Doug Feith. They're already licking their chops at the prospect of somehow pulling Iraq into this new purview that they have to keep America safe.
And they got all this goodwill from the international community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Quite literally 4 days after 9/11, at a national security briefing, Wolfowitz is bringing up Iraq as a place to attack. He says, number 1, Al-Qaeda. Number 2, the Taliban run Afghanistan. Number 3, Iraq. One of these things is not like the other. But, you know, there's still a little bit of wiggle room. Colin Powell is out there saying things like Iraq isn't going anywhere. It's in a fairly weakened state. It's doing some things we don't like, but we'll continue to contain it, he says in fall 2001. But in this moment, I don't want anyone to feel bad for George Tenet, but anytime anyone in intelligence starts to sort of maybe indicate that there are no WMDs of any kind, they have the trump card to play on them, which is, you failed to stop 9/11. How can we trust anything that you say?
Oh!
So the formal Pentagon planning for how to attack Iraq starts in November of 2001. So 2 months after 9/11. To give you an idea of the timeline, the UN Security Council vote offering Saddam an opportunity to comply with inspections was in November of 2002. and the vote in Congress to officially authorize force was in October of 2002. So the military was planning for war a full year before people were, quote unquote, officially starting to talk about war as a possibility. And significantly, the war planning happens before the alleged intelligence about WMD.
And I'll step in here to defend George Bush, who I think is being slandered on this episode. Apparently, you always have to have war plans ready to go to war with any country, just to have them there. And so they did put together these invasion plans at the behest of George Bush. However, it was under the cover of preparing war plans against 30 different countries, just in case, hey, we're attacked, we need a plan. Right? We got to have a plan ready. But we'll see that just by virtue of making these plans, they take on an initiative of their own by the fact that you now have them and you're one step closer.
Yeah, it's like having a gun. You're more likely to use it if you have one. You know? Right. It's like they would use the gun owner's argument, better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And I would say, much like owning a gun, you're more likely to fucking shoot yourself if you have one. And right from the get-go, there's a tension between the office of the Secretary of Defense and the uniform leadership of the military. There's tension over whether or not to attack Iraq at all and over how many troops to use. Now we enter Tommy Franks, the head of CENTCOM, Central Command, yet another office in our sprawling bureaucracy. And there are conflicting accounts, but there's general acknowledgement that he became the fulcrum of planning for the war, and he slowly comes around to the Rumsfeld view. Now, this dude ran such an abusive and low morale office. He's always berating people for speed. You know, we've been attacked. This is a time of crisis. We need it faster. That none of the information that ever came out of CENTCOM was reliable because it was produced almost instantaneously. And one person called them swags, which I love. It stands for scientific wild-assed guesses.
That term gets used in business, actually, quite a bit.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
It's what the Soulja Boy song was about, turn my swag on. So CENTCOM was asked to plan an all-new war just months after carrying out the invasion of Afghanistan. And it took them over a year to figure out how to take down Saddam Hussein's Iraq. And they gave no serious thought on how to replace it. Now, our friend Marine General Zinni, that mastermind architect of containment, like we said, he drafted up that invasion plan called Desert Crossing that called for 350,000 troops back when he was running no-fly zones. So, hypothetically, you wouldn't have to draft up new plans from scratch. You already had some from the era of containment. But his plan was completely ignored. The civilian leadership especially wanted a force that was smaller and faster than either the 1991 invasion or Zinni's Desert Crossing plan. And it's rumored that Rumsfeld was the one who killed it because he said, no, the plan's assumptions are just too pessimistic. It's not going to be that bad. We don't need all those guys and all that money. So this is a plan that had been honed for years from the guy running the military around the country, and it was just completely shelved.
This is the moment in that Rick's book, I believe, where when people would try to put up any opposition to this low number of troops, they'd be rebuked with the saying, well, you know, speed kills. You know, that seems to happen a lot in this story, is like someone will present like a very logical point about why something is not possible, and they're retorted with this general weird mantra, yeah, like speed kills, or the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's meant to counteract the actual information. So it's like, we don't have enough troops. Yeah, but you're forgetting that speed kills, you know. Yeah, it's going to kill us.
Yeah. Shock and awe, I'm sure, is another one. Like, we'll make up for our numerical deficiencies with shock and awe, overwhelming force. I'd love it if they just dropped one of my favorite Russian peasant expressions. The same water that softens the potato hardens the egg. Think about that.
This is also, I believe, where General Zinni is told, like, well, you may not think this is enough troops, but you're forgetting that, one, there's going to be a ton of coalition people involved. And two, Saddam's generals are going to come over to our side and they're going to fight for us, which they never did. But big group project mentality coming from the Department of Defense.
You're forgetting, I got Poland in the group, dude. It's in the bag.
Yeah, you're forgetting other people are going to work harder than we are. Always great when your plan involves other people not involved in the planning.
Yeah, always great when your plan involves things entirely outside of your control.
Exactly. So last point about 2001 here.
Yeah, December 2001, Judith Miller publishes an article about the secret WMD programs in the New York Times. It is entirely false, and don't want to get into the weeds here. Basically, her sources are not clean, and she does no effort to check them.
She's almost too cynical of a person to even be in an Ianucci movie. Like, she's such an evil person for being this much of a careerist.
Yes. She has never apologized. She's never said mea culpa. She never said she was spoon-fed bad intelligence directly from the administration. And I bring this up because you know who at least did apologize? Motherfucking Colin Powell for his UN performance. Also, the New York Times itself apologized for their coverage of Iraq. I'm not saying that wipes the slate clean. Let me be clear. It does not. But Judith Miller, I got this quote from her, from this awful, awful woman, from an article in The Guardian. She said, quote, "But the stubborn myths that remain about the Iraq War," she concludes, "are not the ones that lured the U.S. to invade. They are the ones that continue to hang over my reputation."
Oh, poor Judith Miller. She should never know peace. Okay, moving on to 2002. You know, State of the Union. Every year starts with the State of the Union. George Bush, this is where he comes out with his Axis of Evil speech. Iraq, North Korea, Iran. They compose an axis of evil. And you're seeing a little bit of that neocon ideology get its way into the speech, right? Axis powers, right? They are aligned and they are the bad guys.
Yep.
Like these people would ever have anything to do with each other.
Yeah, this is that 1960s idealism coming through, viewing the world through a lens of moral good and moral evil. In May 2002, the military sends their plans to the Bush White House, basically saying, listen, boss, you got to give me more time. We can't invade by October, which was the initial preferred window, was 1 year after 9/11. And this is because of neoliberalism. It turns out the military uses just-in-time supply chains. And so they didn't have enough precision-guided munitions because they had used too many in Afghanistan. And I read this and I'm like, where is the $1 trillion a year going? You can't do two things at once. You can't do two wars at once.
Didn't Rumsfeld complain that there were no more good targets in Afghanistan? They had bombed it too thoroughly. And that's why we needed to invade Iraq. There are no more good targets.
God damn. Also, at this time, it's the fucking military telling the politicians that they need to, quote, set the conditions to lower the political risks of going to war by conducting an intense round of preparatory diplomacy. You know it's bad when the coolest heads in the room are the soldiers and the generals being like, listen, man, you gotta do some fucking diplomacy, man. I'm not ready for this war.
Yeah, that's one of the saddest parts of this story, reading through the books, is like, you're rooting for the military. They're weirdly the ones that are anti-war because they're going to be the ones that actually have to do it.
Mm-hmm. And Rumsfeld, he's a bureaucrat. He's a bean counter. He made the military fight him for every incremental increase in the size of the force. And these officers are quoted in the Rick's book saying, a lot of folks say the military rolled over for Rumsfeld. We didn't. We did the best we could. Going to meetings with Rumsfeld was his Vietnam, you know? And how is this how you're running the war? Why have generals? I would have supported a military coup at this point if it happened. If the military couped the Bush administration saying, we don't want to do this war, they're doing it bad, I would have supported it.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a repeated theme that comes up here is, why have generals? If you're just going to do whatever you want, 10,000 troops, that'll work, trust me. And they're telling you no, and they're the experts. Why have generals? Just do whatever you want to do, you know? That's what you're going to do. Same thing with intelligence. Why have the CIA if you're going to set it up to have them agree with everything you say? Don't even bother spending all this money on the CIA and generals. Just do whatever you want to do.
Yeah, you're the commander-in-chief. You lead the troops. In June 2002, as we hurtle to war here, Bush makes this radical break in official American foreign policy by saying that the official policy is now preemptive action. This move is neoconservatism. The world is filled with scary dangers, and we need to be proactive with the use of American force. And that's very different from even how W himself positioned himself in the 2000 election. And there's this perceptible shift where by July of 2002, again, nearly a year before the actual invasion and the hard selling of the war, they're settled. This is happening. And now we just need to bring everyone else on board. So the head of MI6 at the time said that when he interacted with his American counterparts, military action was now seen as inevitable. Quote, Bush wanted to remove Saddam through military action, justified by the conjunction of terrorism and WMD, but the intelligence and facts were being fixed around the policy. There was little discussion in Washington of the aftermath after military action.
Yeah, we're going to see that in the next months, it's like they have a policy already decided, and now the intelligence will be fixed around that policy goal.
Yeah.
And it's going to warp all of the intelligence. There's this great story in August of 2002. Bush, less than a year after 9/11, he's decided to take a 1-month vacation in Crawford where he has a Zoom meeting with Tommy Franks.
Mm-hmm.
And Bush is saying that Saddam Hussein is 2 years away from developing a nuclear weapon, which is like, according to who? This is where we're starting to see, like you said, intelligence getting fixed around policy, where it's like you're just going to make stuff up. The CIA estimate at this time is 8 to 10 years, and George Bush is saying 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And in his autobiography, Bush cites Hussein Kamel as his source on that.
The guy who had a traumatic brain injury and defected?
Yeah, the guy who thought he could lead a revolution by driving a bunch of Mercedes to the border of Iraq. That guy. And this is where we're going to start to get people just coming out in public and saying whatever they want, really, without any intelligence to back it up. So yeah, around this time, the realists in positions of power in the Bush administration, they have to be whipped in line, right? The Colin Powells, the George Tenets.
Yeah, Colin Powell is the big one. He's famously quoted as saying, "You break it, you buy it." In August of 2002, he said, "You are going to be the proud owner of 25 million souls. You will own all their hopes, aspirations, and problems."
Yeah, he said it'll suck the air out of the room your whole first term. And boy, was he being optimistic on that one. It's going to be a lot longer than your first term.
Damn, yeah.
Woodward sort of needled Bush on this conversation, actually, because Bush, not only did he cooperate with Woodward writing a book about the process of invasion called Plan of Attack, but he told everybody else that they had to cooperate too. And so Woodward says, do you really understand what Powell was saying to you here about the proud owner of the 25 million people's hopes and aspirations? And George Bush said, yeah. And what he implies that like their hopes and dreams also includes their dreams for freedom. And I'm going to be helping them with those hopes and dreams. So you're forgetting that the hopes and dreams, there's a lot of overlap with the freedom hopes and dreams.
Yes.
I'm more than happy to help with those hopes and dreams.
What about the Iraqis who were hoping for running water and dreaming of antibiotics?
Yeah, personal security. Let's check out on the Maslow's hierarchy of needs where personal security is versus freedom. Oh no. That's the problem. I was looking at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs upside down. Laura had turned it upside down. It's so funny, too, because Powell, reminiscing on this 2-hour meeting, the thing that he sort of remembers the most is he was really worried because 18 months into the job, he didn't feel like he had a personal connection with Bush yet. And after this 2-hour conversation, when he got to bring up the 25 million people and their hopes and aspirations, he was like, oh, good. I finally had this personal one-to-one moment with the president without Rumsfeld or Cheney there. And it's like, bro, there's so much more at stake here than your personal relationship with your boss.
Also, these people are cultists. They are acolytes of the cult of liberty. Like, you can't get through to them. They're a lost cause. One of my favorite skeptic stories is this dude, Brent Scowcroft, who was Poppy Bush's national security advisor. He goes on CBS's Face the Nation, and he said that invading Iraq, quote, could turn the whole region into a cauldron and thus destroy the war on terrorism.
Yeah, he also published an op-ed with the headline, "Don't Attack Saddam," in August of 2002.
Bush's own dad's national security guy writing this to him. And I don't want to put these people up on a pedestal, right? I want you to understand, listener, these people are not comrades of ours. But we just want to drive home the fact that these neoconservative ghouls were able to just whip these motherfuckers into line.
And they're freaks. Like, they're such freaks that even James fucking Baker is like, those guys are crazy.
Henry goddamn Kissinger, the butcher of Cambodia, also made the op-ed round saying don't invade Iraq. And yeah, there's also a whole bunch of Army and Navy guys who publish articles in various Army and Navy newspapers and publications saying to pump the brakes, encouraging a public debate on the merits and pitfalls of containment. But all of this debate is shut down by Dick Cheney in August of 2002 when he says, quote, "There is no doubt that Iraq possesses WMD and that it is a clear and present danger to the United States."
Just comes out and says it. Just says whatever he wants.
Mm-hmm.
I wish we had leftist politicians who behaved like this. And you can just say whatever you want. Who gives a shit? Just say it.
And here's a funny sentence from Thomas Ricks from Fiasco. In retrospect, the speech is even more stunning than it appeared to be then, because it has become clear with the passage of time that it constructed a case that was largely false. And I just went, great use of intransitives in the passage to avoid saying Dick Cheney lied. The speech constructed a case that was largely false. And here's the deal. This Cheney speech even got W off guard, but it becomes the official party line. Donald Rumsfeld is out there saying things like, "We know they have active programs. There isn't any debate about it." This is not some kind of team of rivals West Wing dream of a bunch of people with differing views hammering out the best policy through give and take. This is the vanguard of ideologically coherent freaks coming up with the plan and then justifying it after the fact.
Yep. And Tenet says this caught him off guard too. And Tenet was like, where is he getting this from? He must have information that I don't have, the director of the CIA. And I think Tenet says in his autobiography that he's like, I wish I had said something to Cheney after to indicate that I disagreed. But at the time, I just decided to say nothing. And he must have taken my silence as like tacit agreement. Yeah, bro, you might have dropped the ball there. Because Tenet throughout his autobiography, he says that like he never definitively said that Saddam had WMD, and then even more forcefully says that there is no connection between Saddam and Osama bin Laden.
Yes. And listen to our drones episode where we talk about how big and sprawling the NatSec state is. People were saying, senior military intelligence people were saying, with all the compartmentalization, there's a good chance that a guy that senior has seen stuff that we haven't. It's just like always someone else's responsibility.
Right.
It's always someone else's problem. It's always someone else's fault. Yeah, like a business, like a overly complicated bullshit jobs business. And Cheney very consciously plays this card himself because he'll say things that anyone who doubted his assertions about the threat, quote, they haven't seen all the intelligence that we have seen. And so here's the point that we're trying to drive home here. There basically was no debate on Iraq. There was a sales pitch because a debate involves two sides, pros and cons, you know? And the Bush administration did this great job of shutting down the debates preemptively, much like a preemptive military strike. This was a preemptive shutting down of debate.
Yeah, and we're going to hear from Cheney that the time for debate is over. And you're just like, wait, what? Wait.
When was it?
When were we supposed to be debating this?
And this debate isn't one between the GOP and the Dems. This is the debate between civilian leadership and the military, the various factions of W's own presidency. Yeah, like shutting any debate down.
Which is always great when, yeah, your side of the debate is represented by the CIA and the military. That's great that they're there to debate my side of things, you know? And George Tenet gets out of this a lot of times by saying, well, you know, I present the facts to the president and the vice president, but they're the vice president and they're the president, and they have to decide based on that information what they think is true. They were elected. They're the omnipotent president. They have insight that I don't have as a leader.
George W. Bush famously said, I'm the decider.
Exactly. That's why they pay you the big bucks, Mr. President, as Dick Cheney would always say to him. But yeah, this is how he gets out of it by saying, oh, well, hey, listen, it's my job to present the president with the facts, and it's his job to decide what is fact, basically, to make the decision. And so he says, hey, listen, I've told Cheney that there's no connection, but he knows more than I do because he is the executive.
God damn. Yeah, I love how we've expended so much mental energy in figuring out that it's no one's fault. It's no one's fault.
Okay, so around this time, September 2002, we are getting the civilian leadership definitively stating that Saddam Hussein has WMD, despite the fact that nobody in the CIA believes this. And this is where we start to hear W, Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Donald Rumsfeld, they're all starting to use the same lines when they're talking to the media. They're selling the war.
We got some zingers coming. The marketing department was on fire on this one.
Oh, yeah.
Hold on, Don Draper.
Yeah.
We don't want the smoking gun. become the mushroom cloud.
This happens at work. You'll hear an executive use a phrase and then everybody else starts using the phrase after them. This happens in professional environments. But yeah, you just know that there was like some meeting where Cheney or Bush dropped this line. We don't want the smoking gun to become a mushroom cloud. And it was just like, fire.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other one you hear a lot at this time is the one option we don't have is to do nothing. And this is where Bush starts referring to Saddam Hussein's team of nuclear mujahideens. A new graphic novel from Frank Miller, Nuclear Mujahideens.
I was going to say, that's going to be the name of my new punk band. Nuclear Mujahideen? That's sick, dude.
So, September 2002, this is a section we have on the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate. And when I was preparing for this episode, a lot of my research, I thought, it all comes back to the NIE at some point when we're talking about the invasion of Iraq, because this is the intelligence estimate that the CIA put together to go to Congress to convince them that Iraq had continuing programs for weapons of mass destruction. And it's produced at the request of members of Congress. And so, like, this is the hinge point to me as the most important part of the whole process is, well, how do you get George Tenet and Colin Powell to write this NIE if they're not neocons? Right? That's the blank spot in my mind going into this episode that I was like, I really want to understand this. How did this NIE come to being? Because this is basically going to be the document that makes Hillary Clinton vote to authorize to give power to invade Iraq. This is, I think, one of the most important points in the story.
This is the smoking gun that turned into many, many clouds over Iraq.
And what you find reading through the NIE, or through like George Tenet's autobiography about writing the NIE rather, is he claims he wrote it with all of these vague assertions, like we assess that Saddam could be building weapons of mass destruction, right? You start with like a relatively benign statement like that. And then by the time it gets to the summary version, because no one is reading the full estimate, obviously, right? I don't have time for that. I'm a member of Congress. I got hookers to kill.
We have sex workers to kill, please.
Yeah, we have sex workers to kill. It's become just statements of fact. Saddam Hussein is creating weapons of mass destruction as we speak. He's minutes away, quite literally 45 minutes away.
And normally in the process of developing an intelligence estimate, you have your analysts on the ground who are poring over the raw data. And all these guys, they're looking for a big win. These guys are always connecting dots and they see nefarious stuff anywhere. Then as it gets through higher and higher levels, normally what happens is that people pour some cold water. So you might be jumping to conclusions because people who are higher up know more. And by the time it gets to the executive summary level, all of the wild conclusions that the frontline guys have come to are a lot more understated. But with this document, the opposite happened. With every successive level, it got more and more alarmist.
And so you should understand that while the CIA is in theory an independent entity, George Tenet talks about how, like, at this point, the civilian leadership, like Doug Feith, is coming to the CIA every day and going, hey, we need an update on connections between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein. And he's like, there is none. Coming back the next day and saying, hey, we need an update on connections between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. There is none. And so they're coming back every day. They're bugging him too much. He felt the need to give in to their demands. But they'd come into meetings with the CIA, civilian leadership would, like Donald Rumsfeld and Scooter Libby, and present them with this, like I said, the true crime evidence of saying, well, what about this guy we found in Prague who ran away from Iraq? And Tenet would say, well, I'm the director. I don't know anything about these small details. Let me get you some analysts. And then they're going back and forth, trying to get as much information, get the CIA to at least agree to a general statement about what could be true. So George Tenet gives this amazing example of, I think this was Donald Rumsfeld. He would come in lawyer mode and say, well, one would agree that Saddam Hussein is our enemy, right, Ben?
Yes.
Okay. And one would agree that Al-Qaeda is our enemy, right?
Sure.
And one would agree that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, correct?
Yes.
Well, in that case, then one would have to agree that that would make Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda friends. Like just lawyering them into making these wild accusations ipso facto. And so eventually all of these things pile up into this NIE. And the NIE is so funny to me because it's about taking all of this fucking disparate intelligence, yellow cake, aluminum tubes, Al-Qaeda,
Mobile labs,
the Kawi, and then putting them in a long column of items, right? A long list and saying, look at the size of this fucking list. This document is rock solid. And this is exactly how the credit default swaps, like the CDOs during the mortgage crisis happen, is like taking all of these bad subprime loans, packaging them together and saying, look at this whole package of mortgages. This is rock solid, right? And they're doing the same thing with intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Ricks said that as a political document meant to convince people of the need to go to war, the NIE succeeded brilliantly, but it was an absolutely shameful piece of intelligence.
And so, yeah, Ricks agrees with George W. Bush in Decision Points. The quote he ends the NIE chapter with is, "Responsibility for this low point in the history of the United States intelligence must rest on the shoulders of George Tenet." Who, again, maybe because of 9/11, maybe because he's just an obsequious little weasel who wanted to stay in office longer, he just agreed with what the president was looking for.
Yes. And I love the story of the civilian leadership, just true bureaucratic McKenzie mindset shit, coming up with their own stupid offices to look over the data again that the CIA has already analyzed with their professionals and run up the chain of command. And these people, like Richard Pearl at the Defense Policy Board Advisory Committee or Douglas Feith, the Undersecretary of Defense, they claim that they're just connecting the dots. We're kind of disruptors. There might be something that you missed, CIA, but that our keen, innovative minds will catch when we pour over this information.
No, truly, they are like the Reddit investigators into the Boston bomber. Where they think that they can bring an amateur's magic to this case.
Yeah, and even just down to like the bullshit grammar things, like dropping qualifiers. We are somewhat certain becomes we are certain, or like mays become ours. Cherry picking information, armchair intelligence.
Tenet defends the NIE by pointing out all of this by saying, sure, it says that Saddam ordered aluminum tubes that could be made for a war, but what you're forgetting is that I clearly underlined that it was very unlikely, and I included 17 pages of dissenting opinion from why these aluminum tubes could be used for war materials. Those are so funny to me because, yeah, he's basically like agreeing with the fact that he gave George Bush all this ammunition, but pointed out that if you actually read the NIE, it says that it's highly unlikely, and it's like, bro, grow up.
Oh, you're telling me you're disappointed they didn't read your copious footnotes that said the opposite of the thing in the body text?
Yeah. And he does this for everything in the NIE, the fucking yellow cake, right? That was the other big one, that British intelligence had approached them and said, hey, we have some evidence that Saddam was trying to buy uranium from Niger. Anyway, it turns out that this source was just trying to get a payday. He knows that there's a market out there for Saddam having WMDs, so he just fabricated all of this evidence and was like, yeah, the United States is going to buy this bullshit. They clearly want to buy this at any cost.
The guy's job? Baker. Yellow cake.
Yeah, a known fabricator. Someone like who had done this before. Imagine like a guy from Lord of War or something. We need to make up evidence that Saddam has WMD and sell it to the United States government. So much of the NIE has this wishy-washy language that says like, yeah, he could be using the aluminum tubes to make a weapon, but it is unlikely. Yeah, he could be seeking yellow cake uranium for a nuclear bomb, but it is unlikely, right? It reminds me so much of like listening to fantasy football analysis. I used to listen to like a lot of fantasy football podcasts, but I can't anymore because so much of them is just like, if you're talking about the Detroit Lions, this will be like their predictions for the week, right? They'd be like, oh, Amon-Ra St. Brown, he could score this week. Jamison Williams, oh yeah, he could score this week. Oh, Jahmyr Gibbs, he could score this week. David Montgomery, he could score this week. Jared Goff, he could score this week. Tim Kennedy, he could score this week. And it's like, yeah, that's how it works. Anyone could theoretically score. Like Saddam could theoretically have done anything. It is true that it is possible. It's possible. It's not likely. It's not definitively happening. I could be in San Diego next week. Theoretically, I could be in France next week. Anything is theoretically possible. And so this is what makes the NIE so galling, is it's all these statements of what could technically be possible, rather than what does the CIA definitively think is actually happening. And so George Bush and the civilian leadership are able to seize on these statements of theoretical possibility and express them as fact in the summary. And that's basically the weakness of the NIE.
Yeah.
Because the whole time that they're putting this together, the civilian leadership is over their shoulder telling them, like, why don't you say this? Why don't you say this? And the CIA doesn't believe it. Feith accuses the CIA of being persnickety about the details. Yeah, dude, we're about to invade a country. It might be the right time to be persnickety.
Douglas Feith, for the record, once let a military plane stay on the runway as he fixed the commas in their orders. And this motherfucker was telling the CIA they were being persnickety.
At one point while writing this, Cheney tells the CIA that they needed to be more bold and imaginative.
Oh my God. I hate to go back to the well of sports talk radio, but this is like, and now for the bold predictions corner.
Right. Yeah, the kicker, he could score a touchdown. The punter, he could score. The punter could technically score,
Panay Sewell, we could get a big guy touchdown.
True.
Fumble recovery, big guy touchdown.
We've seen it before. The offensive tackles, they could score. So basically, the NIE is trying to prove 2 points, right? The first is that Saddam Hussein has restarted his chemical and biological weapons program and nuclear weapons program, right? Mm-hmm. A completely separate point is that Saddam Hussein is working with Al-Qaeda. And the basis for the Al-Qaeda claim was that al-Zarqawi, who was in Al-Qaeda, had set up shop in northern Iraq, I think after the invasion of Afghanistan. He needed a new place to do terrorism. The reason he set up in the northern part of Iraq is because it's an autonomous zone, not run by Saddam Hussein.
In fact, monitored and protected by the United States.
Yeah. Saddam Hussein, not a big fan of non-state actors and subversive groups. He had his own issues with them, being a secular dictator. A dictator who prioritized personal control over the country, didn't want to support any destabilizing elements to his own regime. He had the same contempt for these terrorists. It's the reason why after September 11th happened, he thought that it would bring him closer to the United States, because they both had the same goal, which was killing terrorists, fundamentalist terrorists. And so that's why they're able to seize on this connection. In fact, al-Zarqawi and bin Laden apparently were rivals. Saddam, it's not like he was supporting al-Zarqawi being there, but they were able to seize on the fact that someone vaguely related to bin Laden had set up shop in Iraq and was still operating there, which, of course, in the minds of Doug Feith, means that Saddam is giving them tacit approval.
God, I hope these guys don't find out where 16 of the 21 hijackers are
from. Right. Yeah, exactly.
I wonder if Al-Qaeda has any connections to any other Gulf countries.
Tenet talks about how he's like, we only had 19 days to put this together. We slept at the office. And it's like, you slept at the office, you put all this work into this NIE so that you could just lie? What did you need to work so hard on if you were just making all of this stuff up? And so, yeah, I mean, the big claims are the aluminum tubes, the yellow cake, the Mohammed Atta meeting in Prague with someone from the Iraqi government. Taking all of these absolutely disparate points of information, all of which were disproven, and then sticking them in a list and going, look at the size of that freaking list,
And what's so obnoxious, like when you hear apologists and defenders for what went down, they'll say, well, they didn't definitively know that there wasn't any WMD. Which, of course, like you can't prove a negative, right? Mm-hmm. But the lie that they do is one of omission. They lied about the doubts that they had. They left these teeny tiny crumbs and hearsay and bullshit evidence, and they presented it as if it were ironclad, and it painted a whole picture, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you really got the sense from Tenet that he didn't care enough to correct the record about what the government was doing with these soft assertions. Tenet knows that he was providing assertions that said, like, we assess that Saddam Hussein could be developing nuclear weapons. And then he's presumably like watching the president then say, we know for a fact that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. And Tenet in his autobiography says, he defends himself by saying, hey, I told an ombudsman, and apparently the ombuds person said to him, grow up. And that's as far as George Tenet decided to take it.
Yeah, that's some Senate parliamentarian-ass bullshit right there.
Yeah, did you ever think of maybe, I don't know, going to the press?
Wow, yeah, I never realized director of the CIA was such an impotent position.
There's a great quote from Bush in his autobiography, too, where he talks about how before he shared any of this, he went through every single point in the NIE with George Tenet, and we triple-checked it, we quadruple-checked every point in there. We called different countries for every point to have them verify the information. And I'm like, yeah, they just called Israel every time. I don't think they were calling different countries. So anyway, hopefully you have a good sense for like how the NIE became this document that was just the complete opposite of what analysts were actually saying. Because that's the part I was most curious about, is like, how do you have all these analysts have one conclusion and an NIE with the opposite conclusion? And the reason is that, yeah, you basically do like selective quoting from the NIE to create the summary, right? Where you're like leaving out all of the dissenting opinions and just taking the declarative sentences. And by having George Tenet offer as many of these reasons as he could because he was so obsequious and needed approval from the daddy president.
Yeah, and it's important to note that all of the uncertainty disappears as the NIE goes up through the ranks of the hierarchy of the CIA. And as you go up through the ranks of an organization like that, each successive rank is more and more of a political appointment instead of someone who's just hired, right? So more and more political people are just axing all the uncertainty from this document. Okay, so we've done the NIE.
Don't worry, folks. We have a free and responsible free press.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that the intelligence community is actually influenced by the shit reporting of the Judith Millers of the world. I know we laugh a lot at journalists' expense on this pod, but the intelligence people are reading Judith Miller's bad articles to essentially doubt themselves. Say, well, maybe we are wrong. Maybe they're right. It's in the dang news. So we're in about September 2002 now. This is when the public is starting to really focus on the lead up to invasion of Iraq, even though it's already been made behind closed doors. And the Bush administration, in the words of Thomas Ricks, pursued two contradictory delusions about the war. So to sell the war, they looked at the worst case scenarios for the weapons of mass destruction. They ignored or disregarded any contradictory evidence, and they emphasized the possibility of Saddam Hussein using his weapons on America with their smoking gun mushroom cloud line. The second delusion was around the post-war issues, which took the delusionally optimistic leap of faith in the opposite direction, which emphasized every best case scenario. This is where we'll be greeted as liberators, we'll make a new government for the Iraqis really quickly, and we'll all be home real quick. The sales pitch is that the war is both necessary because of the WMD, and also, it's all upside. In the words of Michael Scott, it's win-win-win. It's necessary, it's cheap, and it's quick. Who doesn't love a good, cheap war? They were trying to sell as if we're getting into like Panama or Grenada in the 80s instead of Vietnam Part 2.
So yeah, Bush has his address in front of the United Nations at this point. Iraq is in there, which is kind of funny to look at the looks on their faces while George Bush is delivering this speech. But this is where he asks for the UN's weapons inspectors to be readmitted to Iraq. Since 1998, they haven't been allowed in.
Yeah.
Because the United States, if you recall, was using it to spy on Saddam and try to kill him.
Yes.
And Iraq gives in. They let in the weapons inspectors. And this is one of the most frustrating parts of the entire story, I think, because they don't find anything, basically. And this doesn't fix anything for the neocons. And Cheney didn't even want to do this. Cheney's like, let's avoid the UN and inspections because it's just going to bog down our plan. It might even mean that we can't go to war. You know, if he says he has weapons and he gives them up or something. They really want to oust Saddam. It's not really about the weapons, you can tell, for Cheney, because he sees the weapons inspections as an avenue that could mean they're not allowed to invade. Because what if he just gives us his weapons? Right?
Yeah.
So you just really get the sense that there is no winning for Saddam. Either he gives up the weapons that he doesn't have, or the weapons inspectors find nothing. And then, of course, that means Saddam's hiding the weapons. So,
yeah.
And there's that great clip that Blowback plays on their show of a reporter asking for the press secretary, like, oh, you must be happy that Hans Blix, the UN inspector, didn't find anything, that there are no weapons. You must be happy there's no weapons. And Bush's press secretary is like, well, it doesn't really mean anything. You know, there is no outcome that would have avoided war. If they don't find weapons, it's because Saddam's lying. If they do find weapons, well, we need to invade because he has weapons.
And it's around this time in fall of 2002 that Congress gets to vote on whether or not to authorize force, regardless of any UN authorization. And this all comes down to the NIE that we spent so much time describing. The full 92-page classified version of the document had all the doubts and caveats and disagreements with the Bush administration. Copies of this document were sent to Capitol Hill, where they sat in 2 vaults under armed guards. What do you think the over-under is on how many members of Congress went to the guard vault to read the 95-page document? Only a handful of members actually read anything more than the 5-page executive summary, which, wouldn't you know, it was a lot less nuanced than the 95-page document, which, as we already said, was bullshit anyways. And months after the invasion of Iraq, White House officials would disclose that neither Bush nor Condoleezza Rice had read the entire NLE. When this debate, quote-unquote debate, starts, there is one journalist in the press gallery. At the most intense, fewer than 10% of congresspeople and senators attended the Iraq war vote. Because usually when people don't want to attend, what they're signaling is they don't like what's happening, but they don't feel like they can do anything about it. And it's like, what is this leadership for? It's something that the Michael and Us guys said on our 2004 episode, where the Democrats in particular pretend that they can do nothing to influence public policy. If you are a leader, yes, you are meant to reflect the views of the people, but you can also nudge them in particular directions. Mm-hmm. Lord knows the neocons were able to nudge the fuck out of Americans. Why couldn't the Democrats try and do the same? Instead, you had fucking 10% of people attending. And so, yes, there's a lopsided vote that was basically foreordained. Republicans are obviously going to fall in line with their president. The Democrat strategy, the grand strategy of people who are going to make more money than you and I will ever make in our lives, the strategist, the lanyard-wearing dork, said that they wanted to move on to other issues that would help them more in the midterm elections, which at that point were just 3 weeks away. Got to think of the elections. The Iraq War, not a winning issue for us. We're going to let them have this one.
Don't worry, I'm sure they got some pretty important things done as a result of going along with this Iraq war.
And yeah, this is kind of like a equal and opposite reaction to 1991, where 3/4 of Democrats were opposed to the first Gulf War, if not like outright opposed, and they were just kind of wishy-washy about it. And then when that war was a smashing success for America, the Dems looked bad for opposing it. So yeah, we're not going to get fooled again, in the words of W. Bush.
So funny that they had just authorized the president to use of force, right? Like the whole reason why they were authorizing it ahead of time was, I think Bush and Cheney had come out and said, well, you know, if Saddam hits us with a nuclear warhead, like we need to react right away, right? We don't have time to wait for Congress to authorize. We need to pre-authorize this. Which is like, how did you let yourself get swindled into that one?
You've been pre-authorized for a war.
And yeah, you know, it's post 9/11. This authorization gets more Democratic support than the 1991 Gulf War.
Mm-hmm. And we get some op-eds, you know. The useless neoliberal rag The Atlantic publishes an article in October 2002 called The 51st State? That at least asked all the right questions. It poked holes in the Nazi Germany analogy for Saddam Hussein. It asked questions about the occupation. It asked questions about the exit strategy. Even right-wing think tanks were going down this line. The American Enterprise Institute and the Brookings Institute were saying it was going to take at least 150,000 troops in 5 to 10 years to reconstruct Iraq. And Richard Pearl and the neocons just slap it down. Nope, wrong, not right. These are their ideological allies on paper, and even they were opposed to this thing. And yeah, I don't want this just to be a list of people who are correct and ignored, but I'm going to give you one last one, because I want to really hammer home the point that this war was the fault of 12 guys. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy has a 3-day seminar in fall of 2002. Here are some highlight quotes. Quote, "There is a gaping discrepancy between the Bush administration's ambitious rhetoric and limited commitment. Either it should plan to be in Iraq for years, or it should scale back its goal of transforming the Middle East." Another one. It is overly optimistic that we can take a country that has emerged from under a totalitarian regime with its institutions of civil society and create a beacon of democracy within 5 years. Another one. If we try to transform Iraq into a democracy, we will need more and more troops over time because we will have to quell nationalistic revolts. Another one. Iraq presents as unpromising a breeding ground for democracy as any in the world. It has never really known democracy or even legitimate centralized rule for any great duration. Another one. It should be considered that a small U.S. force sufficient to bring about Saddam's demise might not be sufficient to stop the subsequent bloodletting. Okay, why'd I hit you with all of this think tank quotationery? I just think it's funny because we think of the right wing as being obsessed with debate. Prove me wrong, facts and logic, Young Americans for Freedom, Charlie Kirk, Ben Shapiro, whatever. They fucking love debating. But at this time, Cheney's response to the skeptics is quite literally, the time for debate is over. Now is the time for action.
Yeah, and it's like, wait, the time for debate is over? I didn't even realize it was the time for debate. I missed it.
And lest you think we're glazing the military too much in this episode, I would also add that only one senior ranking member of the military retired in protest of the Iraq War. Shout out Lieutenant General Newbold. I know nothing about him other than that. Because, yeah, the military is the military. Their whole thing is following orders.
Yep, following the chain of command that leads all the way up to Doug Feith telling you, I don't see why the occupation force should have to be larger than the invasion force. It's like, well, if Doug Feith doesn't believe that's true, then I guess we got our marching orders. If Commander Bowtie tells us this...
He's played a lot of Axis and Allies, okay? And yeah, by the fall of 2002, sure enough, the intelligence community, the military, everybody shuts the fuck up. And I'm quoting here, the feeling was, our job is to do what we're told, and this thing is going to happen.
We just sort of mentioned this thing about Doug Feith, how the military is reporting up to these undersecretaries who have no military experience, right? And they're PowerPoint guys. Their work revolves around creating slides, and they're just completely divorced from reality, right? All of the thinking about how a war should work is like, I love this slide that you put in the document here. Mm-hmm. This is so funny. It's like, oh yeah, clearly this is going to work. Did you see the number of arrows and infographics that are here, right? Obviously, this is achieving success. Mm-hmm. Doug Feith, he reminds me of like Connor Roy when he was running for president. Tommy Franks called him the dumbest fucking guy on the planet, right? And it's like, this is who we have orders from.
They rely on PowerPoint slides rather than formal written orders, right? We are going to disrupt the military industry. In this lead up, there is a little bit of planning for what happens after Saddam is toppled, but it's this bureaucratic Kafka novel fuck up where once again, it's all somebody else's job. The Defense Department has 3 separate groups planning for post-war Iraq, and the State Department has 1, and none of them talk to one another, and none of them share information. So it's this thing where 4 groups are doing it, but actually nobody is doing it. If anyone is in charge of it, it is Douglas Feith. And this is a guy who can't even run his own office because he's this micromanaging grammar Nazi who's worried about comma splices and obsessed with getting the PowerPoints just so. And if you are driving and can't click on the thing, there is a slide that is called Achieving Representation, and there are no less than 8 arrows, and it's just a cone where ethnic, tribal, and religious circles are far away from each other, but then they're together at the top of the cone. And it goes from military lead to civilian lead. And it goes from military victory achieved to strategic success. But it's just business buzzwords everywhere.
I count 15 arrows, by the way.
And yeah, the 32 slides in the JTF4 summary of planning for post-war Iraq are, in the words of Thomas Rick, extreme in their incoherence, with unexplained distinctions between military success in Phase 3 and strategic success under civilian lead in Phase 4. These are the people who are going to be planning the occupation of a nation of almost 30 million people. And it's in stark contrast to the military's own planning, where they're crunching numbers that they had from Bosnia and Kosovo, and they came to the conclusion that occupying post-war Iraq would require almost 500,000 troops, 470,000. That's more than triple the number that was eventually deployed under the leadership of the neoconservatives. We're going to make up that difference with slide decks.
I love that quote from Rick's where he just talks about like he went through the PowerPoint slides that we're supposed to reconcile the fact that we did not have enough troops with what the military was saying. And I would love to see these slides because, yeah, I could just see how they would be like, actually, the people who have done this their entire career, they're wrong. What they're not considering is that we can McKenzie this into like some more efficient allocation of troops.
Yeah.
So one last note from 2002, the infamous slam dunk meeting. This comes up in almost every book you read about the invasion of Iraq. George Bush comes to George Tenet and the civilian leadership and says, we need to sell the public on this invasion and Saddam having WMD. Let's go. Like, what do we got? And so George Tenet delivers the case for Saddam having WMD, and George Bush is upset. He's disappointed. And he goes, I don't know. It doesn't seem like something George Q. Public would understand. Is this really the best case we got? And this is where Bob Woodward says that George Tenet goes, what are you talking about, Mr. President? It's a slam dunk. And Bob Woodward says that George Tenet mimes dunking a basketball, like with his full body.
He Air Jordans it. He's stretching it. He leapt in the air. He looked like the shoe logo.
And George Tenet, in his autobiography, I love this because he defends himself by saying, I did say it was a slam dunk, but I did not mime dunking a basketball. It's so fucking funny that's your defense.
That's the hill he's going to die on.
And then, of course, it's a decades-long argument because Cheney and them said, hey, Tenet said it was a slam dunk case. And Tenet defends himself by saying, no, I said that convincing the public was a slam dunk. Saddam having weapons wasn't the slam dunk, but convincing the public that he had weapons was a slam dunk. Specifically, George Bush says this is a weak case. And Tenet says, well, if I could declassify some information, I could make the case stronger. And George Bush says, would the case be stronger if you declassified information? And he goes, oh yeah, that's a slam dunk. And so what people run with is that the entire idea of Saddam having weapons of mass destruction was a slam dunk, rather than like, if we were to declassify information, then the arguments would be stronger. That's the slam dunk, is that the arguments could be better if we declassified information. And Tenet rightfully does defend himself in his book by saying that all these guys make it sound like they were on the fence until I delivered the phrase slam dunk. like this had any impact on whether or not they were convinced about Saddam Hussein having WMD, which of course it didn't, right? They already had it in their mind that they were doing this. But it certainly made it a lot easier to throw him under the bus, because for 10 years, they're going to be saying, oh yeah, George Tenet said it was a slam dunk.
If only he hadn't mined.
I did not mime dunking a basketball. Okay, so let's finally move into January 2003.
Yes, the die has been cast, as Caesar said. Alia jacta est. Congress has voted to authorize the war. Cry havoc and let's slip the dogs of war. Julius Caesar. So in January 2003, the military realizes the plans that they had drawn up were broken. And again, because we said we're talking about two things, the selling of the war and the planning for the war, such as it was. Just 8 weeks before the invasion, there's more bureaucratic restructuring, and the post-war planning is taken away from CENTCOM, moved to Pentagon. They're really improvising the most important phase in the war, which is what do you do after Saddam is gone? Rumsfeld has all this interpersonal beef, so he specifically forbids Zinni from being anywhere near it. The guy who's probably the primary Iraq expert in the U.S. military. They just keep making more and more ad hoc organizations. Like now we got one called the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance. And just adding one more office 2 months before the invasion does not, in fact, make the planning any better, right? It's like the meme about the highways. Just one more lane, bro. Just one more planning office, bro. And it will be smooth sailing. In early 2003, you got Norman Schwarzkopf, the head general from the first Gulf War. He's going off on the civilian leadership and the war as a whole. He's got lots of choice quotes, but I'll just leave this one. Because he's got beef with the civilian leadership because they got no experience or knowledge and they're ignoring all the best informed people. He says, it's scary, okay? Let's face it. There are guys at the Pentagon who have been involved in operational planning for their entire lives, okay? And for this wisdom, acquired during many operations, wars, schools, for that just to be ignored, and in his place have someone who doesn't have any of that training, it is of concern.
Yeah, this is just another example of a guy, Eric Shinseki, Chief of Staff of the Army, is talking about why, we're going to need more people just to give out water and food, because that's usually needed after. And the civilian leadership's reaction is to reprimand him, right? This is what's happening happening is voices who are telling you what you want to hear are promoted and given special attention and duties, and people who are skeptical of your plans are reprimanded.
Yeah, they hang him out to dry. And yes, even now, we are in, January, February 2003, the invasion's in March, they're still whittling down troop numbers. There's a unit of military police whose job it was to secure Baghdad. They kept their spot in the plan, but had a 2/3 reduction in people. This would lead to looting. One Marine infantry division was meant to control all of Anbar province. This is a huge one on Iraq's west that borders Syria. But then in January 2003, instead of an entire division, this region would be a, quote, economy of force area with a small number of special forces troops whose primary job, rather than securing the borders of the roads or anything like that, was to prevent Scud missile launches towards Israel. So this lets a whole bunch of Ba'athist and future insurgents escape into Syria. Finally, we have our last chance in Congress. There's some more hearings and some grillings and some debates. They at least have the opportunity to ask some questions about all the question marks about the war. But Congress, they don't really raise a ruckus. Thomas Ricks calls this chapter the silence of the lambs because instead of hawks and doves, we just got a bunch of lambs silently walking to the slaughter. Douglas Feith gets called up before Congress, and he couldn't answer the question of how many troops might be required, or what the war might cost, or even what other countries might join the war effort. The war's 3 months away! You've had 18 months! And some of these senators just throw up their hands. Lincoln Chafee of Rhode Island said, "Why are we hearing more about a worse case? And what are you prepared for in that instance?" Barbara Boxer of California said, "You're not giving us much." And Joseph Robinette Brandon said, "The American people have no notion of what we are about to undertake." Which is all fine and good, but may I add one more question? Why the fuck didn't you ask these questions before voting for war?
Yeah, he's already has the authorization.
And if you think that's just a rhetorical question, Senator Russell Feingold actually did ask that question, asking, quote, "Why do we give the president a blank check to go ahead with this before we had all the answers to these questions?" I don't know, bud. Ask your fellow senators. You did it. Yeah, they're just totally passive, and they let the Bush administration tap dance all over them.
February 2003, this is our last chance because Tony Blair says he can only go with Bush if they get UN authorization for the invasion. And so this is where Colin Powell goes in front of the United Nations and he plays the hits. The mobile weapons labs, the 500 tons of chemical weapons, of yellow cake, of connections to Al-Qaeda. Basically all the things that the NIE was saying. Powell gives this speech in front of the UN, putting his credibility on the line, with George Tenet right behind him. Tenet excuses this in his book by saying he didn't want to, but Powell was a close friend. So his friend asked him to. I had to be a good friend. Despite the fact that Tenet claims that there was no evidence for WMD, and he knew that, and that there was no connections between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and he also knew that. He sat behind him because he was his friend. So yeah, there's just so many stories in that presentation of basically all of the information coming from known fabricators. Tenet claims for Curveball, for example, who is one of the code names given to the intelligence sources, that was from Germany, supposedly a former weapons worker from Iraq that had moved to Germany. Just a guy that had gone completely insane and was known to make up things. And so even though the German intelligence had said, oh yeah, you can't take anything he said seriously, he's insane. We also learned later that he was the brother of a top aide for Ahmed Chalabi,
a guy on the CIA payroll and who was constantly feeding bad intel. Curveball was never actually in U.S. control. He was never interviewed by anyone in U.S. intelligence. In May 2004, the CIA and DIA would issue a classified report that recanted everything Curveball said, which had already been distributed in 101 separate intelligence reports. He was the main source behind the mobile weapons labs, if I recall correctly.
Tenet says he never got the memo that Curveball was unreliable and had a burn notice put on him. Even though German intelligence had told the CIA, he claims that message never got to me.
I hate checking my emails too, so.
He claims the message was sent to this one specific guy in the CIA that he met with 22 times and never mentioned it to him.
God damn it.
Yeah.
So yes, Powell's speech does the trick. The skeptics in the media and the U.S. military were immediately satisfied because he has such a sterling reputation. Quoting Ricks, the Bush administration's approach to selling the war in Iraq was to say, trust us. And Powell was one of the nation's most trusted figures, especially among moderates and liberals.
And this is the point I think that Blowback makes, is that if anyone could have stopped the war who was not a neocon, it was Powell in this moment. But he decided that he needed to be a good boy for his boss.
Had to be a good little soldier. And yes, they can't get a second resolution passed. They want to take the resolution to the Security Council to try and basically run back the Gulf War, have a full UN authorization for the war, but they end up pulling it because it's going to get vetoed by a bunch of people, including France.
France and Germany, most namely. And of course, George Bush says this is because France has oil interests in Iraq.
Projection.
yeah, seriously. Blix doesn't find anything. They can't get authorized, so they remove the second resolution that's meant to authorize the invasion. And so at this point, George Bush gives an ultimatum to Saddam. He says you have 48 hours to leave the country or else we attack, which truly showing a brilliant understanding of Saddam's psychology.
Yes, as we said in part 1.
The only thing he cares about is staying in power. And so now that you've given him an ultimatum, the one thing that you should never do, because now you have to attack if you get to the end of that time. And yeah, Tenet says we never considered the possibility that Saddam did not have any weapons of mass destruction, which is so funny to me because that's one of 2 outcomes. Yeah, he says the usual problem that you run into is that countries say they have no WMD programs, but they actually do. Saddam was doing the opposite. He was saying that he had WMDs, but didn't actually have any. He was unable to comprehend of that reality. And so George Bush explains this whole Iraq situation as being 2 tracks of coercion, diplomacy and military. But then once the diplomacy track runs out, you got to get on the military track. They're going to converge at the same time. And our leverage will never be higher than when they converge. And our leverage was never higher, and it didn't matter.
And the war begins in March of 2003.
Okay, themes and big ideas.
The first big theme that we had, but we ended up peppering throughout the history lesson, was the shutting down of any debate and the fact that there were 12 neocon guys who made this happen. And I say this only because when people try to historicize the Iraq War, they'll say something along the lines of, you got to understand, Bush had a 90% approval rating after 9/11, and the Iraq War itself had a 70% approval rating when they polled Americans. But that narrative completely understates how we got to those numbers, which was the complete silencing or ignoring of anyone who was raising objections at that time. And I'm not even necessarily talking about the canceling of the Dixie Chicks, but just ignoring the people in the military, ignoring the few voices in intelligence, certainly ignoring the unpatriotic libs, your Bernie Sanderses of the world, and as we'll talk about in a different theme, and the media, just giving a megaphone to all the most wrong people instead of the people who are correct. We didn't get to those numbers of 70% approval to the Iraq War in a vacuum. It was a very targeted campaign to sell the war and get people on board, which we described. Okay, theme number 2 is the 10,000 Cassandras in the lead up to Iraq, an interrelated theme. For my Greek mythology heads, Cassandra was a prophetess in Greek mythology who always told the truth, but was never believed. I want to just quickly tell this story of this guy, Ike Skelton, centrist Democrat from Missouri. He's dead now. Goes back to the FDR days. Leading member of the Senate Armed Services community. And so Skelton writes a letter to the president. And he's such a Midwestern normie boomer History Channel dad guy that he's quoting Karl von Clausewitz. He's quoting Sun Tzu. And even though the official Bush party line became, no one foresaw the difficulties of post-war Iraq, Skelton did. And in the letter he wrote, as did a whole bunch of other experts on the Mideast, like we already quoted, and some strategic thinkers in the army. And to quote Skelton's letter, he said, I have no doubt that our military would decisively defeat Iraq's forces and remove Saddam. But the proverbial dog chasing the car down the road, we must consider what we would do after we caught it. I am worried about the extreme difficulty in occupying Iraq with its history of autocratic rule, its balkanized ethnic tensions, and its isolated economic system. He asked to see detailed advanced occupation planning and wanted to know more about the form of a replacement regime and the possibility that this regime might be rejected by the Iraqi people, leading to civil unrest and even anarchy. Babe Ruth pointing at the bleachers.
Mm-hmm.
And there was zero written response to this letter. The closest he got to a response was a White House congressional liaison telling him, well, Congressman, we don't really need your vote. We got the votes. Who gives a shit? General Zinni, another Cassandra. He was a keynote speaker at the Marine Corps birthday dinner, a thing I didn't know existed, but is apparently the biggest day of the year for Marines. And he said, quote, we have to understand that when we're ripping the guts out of an authoritarian regime, you've got responsibility for security, services, everything else. You had to be prepared to handle all that. Don't count on it when somebody tells you, well, the State Department's got that, or OSD, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, is planning for that. Don't believe them. You're going to get stuck with it. So have a plan.
Wow.
Cassandra moment number 3, a conference at National Defense University. That's like a multi-day conference where they say that occupying Iraq will be the most daunting and complex task the U.S. and the international community will have undertaken since the end of World War II. They recommended there should be a phased downsizing of the military to avoid dumping 1.4 million men into a shattered economy.
Mm-hmm.
They produced a report for this conference. They sent it to Douglas Feith's office, left on red.
Yeah, so November 2002.
Mm-hmm. And then last one, Cassandra moment number 4. Army, Pentagon, they convene another fucking conference. They can't stop having conferences. Dozens of experts, diplomats, intelligence officials, the Army War College to talk about post-war Iraq. They made 2 specific recommendations, which are going to be exactly what Paul Bremer III would not do when he ran the occupation. They recommend keeping the army intact, and they recommend not pursuing top-down debathification. Womp, womp, womp. Hundreds of thousands of man-hours of labor went to total waste in all of these conferences, meetings, colloquia, op-ed writing, and publications, all for fucking nothing, and 1 million Iraqis died because of it.
Mm-hmm. The idea of like having all of these experts and conferences and just completely disregarding it in favor of the idealism of these 12 guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, big idea number 3, the absolute uselessness of Congress. I mean, what else needs to be said? They voted overwhelmingly for the Iraq War. They did not read the NIE. They gave the authority to attack another country. I'm not going to be one of these wieners who gets hung up on the Constitution, but it is Congress's job to declare war. And I don't think they've officially declared war since World War II.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the uselessness of the media. Judith Miller, she won the Pulitzer or something, right, for this?
Yep. And I just want to read some reactions to Colin Powell's UN speech from the Washington Post. Before it was purchased by Jeff Bezos, Mary McGrory wrote, "He persuaded me. Powell took his seat in the United Nations and put his shoulder to the wheel. He was to talk for almost an hour and a half. His voice was strong and unwavering. He made the case without histrionics of any kind, with no verbal embellishments. San Francisco Chronicle called it impressive. The Hartford Courant, masterful. Overwhelming, said the Tampa Tribute. Marshal Dillon facing down a gunslinger in Dodge City, wrote the Denver Post. They are creaming themselves over Colin Powell.
Good God.
Just immolating his reputation in front of the world.
Yeah, Tenet in his autobiography said, oh yeah, it was a great speech. He gave it so well. I'm like, yeah, any thoughts on the things that he said?
The content?
Yeah, and then our second last theme here, just on the McKenzie mindset of doing war, right? Thinking that you can make up for a lack of troops because you're already in a war by having really good slides prepared, you know?
Even before the Iraq War, the military hated Donald Rumsfeld because he's bringing the CEO mindset. He's canceling weapon programs that have been in the works for years because he says they're not innovative enough. You're not thinking innovatively. You're not disrupting, you know?
Mm-hmm. And finally, the special relationship. I know we've sort of like skipped over this because it didn't come across in too many of the sources we read, but the sense they give is that the British were basically just super eager to be the United States' lapdog, did not want to publicly disagree with them, which is something we'll see in our review of In the Loop, just willing to keep the special relationship intact at all costs. We don't want to publicly disagree with the United States because they're our daddy, basically. And I think Tony Blair had a bit of end of history brain himself. And, we always make fun of that Francis Fukuyama essay for being wrong. But I think what it was right about was that people actually thought this way. That's the way in which the essay is correct, is that this is how people thought. That like, hey, we've figured out the perfect economic system and we need to share this at the end of a gun.
Yeah. And Tony Blair's doing some B-league geopoliticking where when he sees Germany and France start to go another way, he sees an opportunity. He's like, oh, if France and America are pulling away and they're trying to make like Europe a different bloc, I'm going to hitch my wagon to America, which was emphatically the wrong move. But I do think that he was a true believer in the cause. There's a quote where he says, if we backed away now, it would have disastrous consequences for a tough stance on WMD and its proliferation and for our strategic relationship with the US, our key ally. And for what it's worth, the UK spy agencies were telling Tony Blair the odds of Saddam having WMD, 50-50, which, makes sense. Like we said, there's two options. Either he does or doesn't. So 50-50 is probably a pretty safe bet.
That is the safest bet, because you could always claim, well, it was 50-50.
Coin flip.
There's no way to prove you wrong.
The ultimate loser. A quarter of his party votes against the war, but 3/4 don't.
Yeah, maybe a deep dive on that in the works at some point. But in the meantime, we'll give you a quick film review for Armando Ianucci's In the Loop, which is about this special relationship between the UK and the US and the invasion of Iraq. So like Three Kings, sort of just bringing in a movie as a little palate cleanser that speaks to this historical moment in the days leading up to the invasion, and watching the United States and the UK try to finagle its own members and the public into this immoral war.
I had seen this movie already, and I think it is, as our friends in the UK would say, I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, I love Ianucci in general, so I thought it was very good.
Yeah, I love this movie because, like The Death of Stalin or like Veep, it is about a bunch of cynical careerist climbers. One thing that I love about this movie is that it barely touches on the ethics of doing the war. It takes for granted that the war is immoral and bad. And we are just seeing these people's reaction to the war. And how can they position themselves and their career in reference to this horrible, awful thing that's happening?
This is like the sentiment that links all of Ianucci's works largely together, right? Is that it's about these sort of competent people, but the most important thing to them is their career, not the country, right? Their mission is to advance their career, not to do whatever civic job they're ostensibly in charge of. It's very anti-West Wing, anti-Leslie Knope in its approach to these characters.
Yes.
And so this story is originally based off of a TV show called The Thick of It, which is pretty funny. I watched that one to prepare for this as well. And it takes these characters from the thick of it and puts them into the invasion of Iraq, that setting. And so you have Simon Foster, played by Tom Hollander, the rich gay guy from season 2 of White Lotus. He's sort of caught between these two factions in the United States. The people that want to go to war, like Donald Rash, who you might recognize from Succession, and the people who are trying to fight the war, like James Gandolfini's character, the Pentagon liaison for Secretary of Defense, and Karen Clark, who's the Secretary of State for Diplomacy.
They also all have their little handlers, their little minions that go along with it. And I would add before we get going, Iraq is never named. It is a nameless American-led intervention in the Middle East, which I think is brilliant because it doesn't ground its satire so firmly in the particular historical moment of 2003. They try and be a little bit broader and a little bit vaguer with it, but it is about cooked intelligence and an invasion in the Middle East. So you know what they're talking about.
Gotcha. And so Simon Foster is this character who I think he plays the Minister for International Development. And his character is someone who is kind of stupid, but believes himself to be smarter and more important than he actually is. So there's a few lines early on in the movie that speak to this where he says, like, I'm a minister, like, I'm smart. I've gotten here through my wits and I can make a difference in the world. Yeah. And so he's someone who believes that he should be more important than he is. And when he offhandedly makes a stupid comment to the media one day, specifically that war in the region is unforeseeable. This gets picked up in the American press and thrusts him into the middle of this conflict between pro-war people and anti-war people. All the while, his boss, the Minister for Communications, Peter Capaldi, is that his job?
Yeah, Peter Capaldi plays the communications director for the Prime Minister's office.
He plays this extremely angry, funny,
vulgar,
yeah, who is just trying to get Simon Foster to take his foot out of his mouth and don't fucking say anything that you shouldn't be saying, toe the line.
And the funniest thing is that he's presented with an impossible task. So he's like, if war is unforeseeable, then what is it? Is it foreseeable? He says, don't say it's foreseeable. You've just declared war.
Right. Don't rock the boat. A lot of the comedy in this movie stems from the fact that Simon Foster has to say things that don't really say anything at all. So he gets to America to make his statement. The anti-war people are trying to use him as a prop, and he says,
I'm certainly hearing both sides. In England, we have a saying for very situations such as this, which is that it's difficult, lemon difficult.
There are several allusions to the real-life situation of the invasion of Iraq, namely all the stupid fucking committees being set up and how they're used to circumvent the regular channels that should be used for debate and planning. They set up the Future Planning Committee, which is secretly planning the war. That's a stand-in for some of the stupid committees that we brought up earlier that Doug Feith was setting up.
They reference the fact that to say anything true is career suicide. So Karen Clark's Secretary of State for Diplomacy, she has an assistant, someone basically fresh out of college who writes a policy paper called Post-War Planning, Parameters, Implications, and Possibilities, or PWIP, as it's called in the film, that is poking all the holes in what might happen. And she is just roasted and dragged by fellow social climbers at her level of the hierarchy for writing this, because it's career suicide to point out the flaws in the war plan.
Very cynical. I love it. Classic Ianucci. I think most of the comedy in the movie also revolves around the Brits and how obsequious they are to the Americans, right? It's like they work for the Americans. The Americans are these young, driven people, and all the Brits do is supplicate to them, right? That is towing the line, is to just do whatever the Americans want. Don't cause any ruckus. Don't upset the Americans. There's a paper that is used as evidence for the war. And I think in the movie, they just take a student's paper and they basically just copy and paste it and remove all of the cons, right? They take out all the cons of the list.
They take out all the caveats.
And Tenet admitted to doing something like this in his autobiography, where they needed a declassified version of a classified NIE. And so it would take too long to write a new one. So they just copy and pasted some paper that they found that was already written. There's a figure called Iceman. That's the primary source in the paper, which is clearly an allusion to Curveball. James Gandolfini, like I said, he plays the liaison for the military. And I think it's an interesting role for him to have taken, because he is a guy that did a lot of USO tours and was particularly interested in veterans. And I just wonder if he was attracted to this role because, first of all, we know that James Gandolfini wants to play a general, right? Because that's what Tony Soprano would want to do. But specifically a general who does not want to go to war. And I wonder if his experience in Iraq made him think, oh, I'd love to play one of the generals that was trying to stop this from happening.
Yes, but not trying so hard that he'll sacrifice his career.
Right.
Towards the end of the film, as the dominoes are falling and it's looking increasingly like we're going to war, 3 different characters think about resigning in protest. And there are some very, very funny scenes where Simon Foster, he's constantly threatening to step down, but he doesn't. Peter Capaldi can dangle another little opportunity in front of him and he'll just keep going along. But there's a moment where he's talking it through with his aide and he says, "What's so brave about doing the right thing? Isn't in a way it braver to go along with it despite your morals?" Just these spineless, pathetic fucking people at the heights of power.
Yeah. Just a quick note on style. I've noticed that one of Ianucci's key comedic tricks is to create a situation in which a character makes some public statement or promise based on their own ideology, and then has a higher authority reprimand them for taking a stand, which causes them to have to do a 180 and ignore the previous statement that they've already made, but only to find that because the word got out, the higher authority now changes their mind and wants them to go with the original thing that they said. And so the characters essentially have to do 2 complete 180s, which leaves them in like the same position that they started in, but without any of their credibility anymore.
Yes.
This is a trick you see all the time in The Thick of It, in this movie, and in Veep.
Yeah, there's a moment where they're in the UN and they're doing the UN vote, and Peter Capaldi's angry, aggressive, vulgar Scot just bullies the British ambassador to the UN to move the vote up so that they can vote this war into happening. And then it's revealed that he needs to like cook and doctor the evidence in order to get the vote, so he needs more time. And so after this ambassador has burned all of his credibility to move it up, he then needs to go back and move it not even back to its original time, but even later. It's great. It's good comedy.
Once again, just like Three Kings, just wanted to give you a little palate cleanser for a movie that speaks to this historical moment so perfectly.
In terms of the difference between British and American politics, Jordana already mentioned all the Americans are young. I think that comments on the neoconservative generational divide that we mentioned, but all the British people are kind of middle-aged, kind of older, and all of the aides are these young, like fresh out of Ivy League, lanyard, chipper guys. And the Brits are all just kind of dour and older, which is played for laughs and is very funny. And then we don't ever get to see any American people, but Simon Foster is an MP for this podunk little town, and he has to go back. The contrast between his glassy office, where he's the Minister for International Development, and he goes back to podunk Little Britain, where he has to repair a senior citizen's garden wall, and eventually, at the climax of the film, the wall falls down and is in the tabloid press, and Peter Capaldi's political fixer character fires him for it so that he won't even have the opportunity to resign in protest. Just beautiful.
Because of a story that Peter Capaldi has planted, too, about the wall. But one of my favorite things I think the movie was also trying to say was like how small British government can feel compared to the American State Department. Simon is only included in this mission originally to be meat, right?
Yes.
Like to be an extra body in the room during the meeting so that the Brits can feel like they're bringing as many people as the Americans to this meeting to give some sense of gravitas. And Simon speaks up in a meeting that he's only meant to be meat in.
Yes.
Because he doesn't really understand why he's there.
And maybe my favorite line of the entire film is as Simon watches impotently as the world votes to go to war, he's done nothing to stop it. He may have even helped it happen. He just goes, well, that's that then. And his aide looks at him, he goes, that's that then. Like that is the level of depth and introspection of a political leader. That's all he can bring himself to say. It's so good.
Really speaks well to this British sense of inferiority complex that they have with the United States, I think.
And then, of course, Peter Capaldi, the fixer, he's Scottish, so he's got a double inferiority complex.
Don't call me fucking English.
Yeah, there's a scene where him and James Gandolfini are just going at it, saying heinous things about one another. And the only thing that he calls James Gandolfini out on is calling him English instead of Scottish. It's a very vulgar movie in an awesome way. I watched this with my parents, and whenever I watch something with my parents, who are a bit older, I go to IMDb and I look at the parents' guide to see what I'm going to be watching with. And it's fine. There's like a lot of curse words. There's over 100 F-bombs, and Peter Capaldi says over 80 of them. Incredible.
So, concluding thoughts.
Yes. So, Jordana, what do you think? Was it right to invade Iraq?
we didn't know. It was a scary world out there after 9/11. There could have been a nuclear bomb happening in any city in America on any given day. There's a lot of stuff that could happen.
Yeah. I think the long snapper could get a touchdown this week. My big concluding thought, right? So sometimes I think the question, did they lie about the WMD, kind of misses the point. Though they absolutely did. Like 12 guys just wanted a war real bad, and they used the WMD as an excuse. And frankly, that truth is way more frightening to me. The fact that there's just this club, this cadre, that wants a multi-generational crusade jihad to remake the world around American might is way scarier than any questions of like false statements. If it weren't WMDs in Iraq, it would have been some other excuse. It would have been maybe some other country. But if your takeaway from the Iraq War is America should only go to war with good reasons, and you better not lie us into the war, then you haven't learned anything from the history of the Iraq War. Your takeaways from this period of the war should be something like this. Number one, there are some scary fucking warmongering ghouls in America, and we need to keep them away from the levers of power however we can. Number two, despite the scope of the U.S. government, the intelligence community, the military community, the Nats at stake, and all the other stakeholders like your think tanks and your media, 12 guys with a plan could really fuck shit up. And it's crazy how hard it could be to stop an ideologically coherent vanguard. And point number three, if some online anti-communist ever tries to run the script of communism and socialism are the most destructive ideologies of the 20th century, and that's why we can't have Medicare for all, you should just retort that neoconservatism and McKenzie mindset are two of the most destructive ideologies of the 21st century so far.
Ever since Trump was elected, I've heard a lot of people talk about George Bush wistfully. Like, I wish we could at least have a respectable opposition again. You know, I didn't like George Bush, but at least he was like what a Republican should have been, right? And I really don't buy this at all, because he actually followed through with his demonic designs, unlike Donald Trump. Okay, let's accept sincerely that Bush had end of history brain. He truly believed that every country in the Middle East was months away from democracy, if only they would get rid of their despot. Let's say that he was sincerely worried about 9/11 too, bigger, longer, and uncut. Even if we accept all this, he's still guilty of circumventing the military, the CIA, and the press for the purposes of going to war, right? And if you blame this on Cheney and Feith and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and say, he was with a bad crowd, I'm sorry, but if you're the president, you don't get to blame your friends and say that they were a bad influence on you.
You hired them. The buck stops with you.
And, I saw the movie Warfare recently, which I really liked. I really did enjoy it. I'd recommend seeing that in theaters if you can, because the sound is really important in that movie. But it just really made me think so much of those support the troops stickers from the 2000s. Because anytime you wanted to express any opposition to the war, you were browbeat as being unpatriotic. You're not supporting the troops. You're not supporting the young boys over there who are fighting for us and are suffering, right? And you read through these stories and you're like, well, Donald Rumsfeld wanted to invade with 10,000 guys. I don't mean to sound like Aaron Sorkin, but how is that supporting the troops, right? These fucking ghouls really got away with trying to cancel us over the dumbest shit while putting these people, the soldiers who fought in Iraq, in absolutely heinous situations. You see guys getting maimed in this movie. And I really like the movie because they never show these soldiers, spoiler alert, but they never show these soldiers killing any enemy combatants in this movie. Only the U.S. soldiers getting maimed, and just how fruitless and unclear the entire mission was. You really feel for these guys who were stuck with this mission of occupation, and it really makes you hate the civilian leadership who made them do this, especially knowing that they were fucking bow tie guys who decided that they knew more than everybody. Anyway, I'll stop talking about warfare because we're going to talk about it in our part 4 episode on the insurgency with guest the podcast Bang Bang.
Their designs were truly grand and messianic. I remember reading years ago, I think it was in Max Blumenthal's book, The Management of Savagery. I know Max Blumenthal's kind of cooked his brain a little bit. I think he's a anti-vaccine guy now. But in the original PNAC manifesto, the Project for a New American Century, they wanted to knock over 6 Middle Eastern nations. Now, fortunately for us, they only got 4. They only got Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Just think it could have been worse.
It's funny too, because George Bush, there was an interview, I think in 2010, where he said he was very sad that they never found WMD. It was really disappointing, which shouldn't that be a good thing? But anyway, he says he doesn't regret it because he's introduced the flower of democracy to the Middle East. And it's going to take time for them to develop a system of freedom that works for them. And it won't be within my lifetime. It'll happen after I die. But at some point, what I did is going to cause the Middle East to be a democracy. And that's just such a great way to explain all of your mistakes, is to be I know it looks like I fucked up, but long after I die is when actually everything's going to come together.
You know who else would have died of natural causes eventually? Saddam Hussein.
Yeah. He points out, he's like, well, Saddam, there's no telling what he would have done if he stayed in power. He could have killed us all. And it's like, yeah, you just throw up these completely disprovable scenarios and say, oh yeah, after I die, everything's going to come together. That's a great way to explain away all of your mistakes. Closing thoughts for me are, this episode's been a lot of setup about how the civilian leadership begged to use a lot less troops than the military was recommending. And we're going to see in our next episode on the first year of the occupation what this means in practical terms, how this actually affects the conditions on the ground. And secondly, we've talked a lot about the ideology of free market liberalism. And we're also going to see next week what the practical effects are of this ideology, what it actually means to get rid of all of the subsidies that a centrally planned, ostensibly socialist government like Saddam was running. And so all of these high-minded ideas are going to meet the wall of reality in our next episode.
All right, that's been your Remember Shuffle, part 2 of our Iraq War series. Thank you for indulging us with what I'm sure is another very long one. Please like, please subscribe, please write us a comment. We love any and all feedback. We've heard some people say they love the We Live in a Society episodes. We've heard some people say they enjoy the palate cleanser episodes between them. And of course, check out our Patreon. We got 2 bonus episodes up. Another 1 or 2 coming in the near future.
And also leave us an Apple review. I read George Tenet's autobiography. Surely that's worth an Apple review.
Yeah, shout out to my co-host Giordano. I read the Rick's book because it was great, and then I reread some chapters of the Steve Coles book that we did for last one, but I refuse to read any memoirs. I do not fuck with autobiographies. Ever. I
just kind of was curious to see how these people explained away making such a gigantic mistake in a public forum. And I was just thinking the whole time, it's awesome that we have a Patreon now. And I'm imagining myself revisiting topics like this and being able to devote more time to them. I would love to read Doug Feith's book. I would love to read Colin Powell's book. I'd love to read Condoleezza Rice's book. And so maybe for an episode far in the future, we can revisit this and devote more time to it.
Yes. Listener, I had to convince Giordano to do a multi-part Iraq War series, and now he is totally Iraq War pilled. So we've guaranteed that Giordano will never not be angry ever again.
I finally figured it out who the culprit was.
Yeah, join us next time for the 3rd and final Iraq War episode, where we will discuss the free market libertarian occupation of Iraq, and we will pair it with Green Zone, starring Matt Damon.
Ben, your Iraq War series is going to be a quagmire. Where do you end it? Do you end it with the sectarian violence? Do you end it with the Civil War? Do you end it with the U.S.'s withdrawal? Do you end it with ISIL? You understand there's no exit strategy that you have. You have not observed the Powell Doctrine.
ISIS episode, Patreon, because that's 2010s. All right, that's all we got for you. Ciao, ciao.
Peace.
You mentioned that the World Trade Center came down during George W. Bush's
Absolutely
presidency.
right.
Are you blaming him for
I'm
that?
not blaming him, although the CIA and other groups, but the CIA said there was a lot of information that something like that was going to happen. Could he have done something about it? His CIA knew about things happening. I mean, you could have said, but when Jeb gets up and says, we were safe under his brother, we weren't safe. First of all, his brother got us into the war in Iraq, which is one of the worst catastrophes ever. There were no weapons of mass destruction. The World Trade Center came down during his reign, so you can't say that we were safe under his reign when the World Trade Center comes down and the CIA said something like that was going to happen.
George W. Bush is a pretty popular guy in South Carolina, and when you say that he lied, as you did, and you said that weapons weren't there, I mean, the intelligence...
There were no weapons of mass destruction.
But this is basically the Democratic Party lying.
Look. I tell the truth, okay? There were no weapons of mass destruction. I'm just saying he went in there, he thought there were weapons of mass destruction, maybe, or maybe he didn't, okay? But he thought there were weapons, and there weren't. So I'm telling the truth.
But you said he lied. That's a little more than just he thought.
If he knew that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, and if he used that as an excuse to go in and try and make up for some sins for previous years, then it would be a lie. But I don't think, maybe that's true and maybe it isn't true.
Impeached. You wouldn't own that anymore. You had once said in 2008 you thought he should be impeached.
Let me tell you something. The war in Iraq has been a disaster. It started the chain of events that leads now to the migration, maybe the destruction of Europe. He started the war in Iraq. Am I supposed to be a big fan? We spent $2 trillion on that war. We lost thousands of lives. We have wounded warriors who I love all over the place. It shouldn't have started. We would have been so much better off if Bush and the rest of them went to the beach and didn't do anything. If you had Saddam Hussein, who's a bad guy and all of that, but he made a living off killing terrorists. Now, if you want to become a terrorist, you go to Iraq. That's like the Harvard of terrorism, okay? So, look, it was not a great job. Now, people can say he's popular. I don't know why he's popular.